co-editor of the book Queer Excursions, Retheorizing Binaries in Language, Gender, and Sexuality, and has published widely on the relationship between language, gender, and embodiment in transgender and queer communities. His talk today is entitled From Flesh to Self on the Transgender Nexus of Language, Embodiment, and Identity. Please join me in welcoming Professor Zimman.
Thank you all so much for coming. I want to make a couple of kind of preliminary things. Thanks to Stina so much for inviting me, and to the department for hosting me. Thank you all for coming and hearing me talk about this. I'm trying to sort of balance with the awareness that some of you have read some of the research that's informing this talk and others of you have not, but hopefully I can kind of strike a good medium ground, and I also have some new data that's not in those publications that we can look at. So yeah, as my research does in general today, I'm interested in thinking through some of the aspects of the relationship between language, embodiment, and identity, and specifically taking this approach of looking at everyday language use as a kind of view of how bodies are actually imbued with social meaning. So this involves thinking about how sex is normatively constructed, but importantly, it also involves thinking about how biological sex, embodied sex, might be reconstructed or constructed differently to sort of fit different kinds of social and institutional goals. So I'm going to be talking about one potential alternative model to thinking about the social meaning of bodies, which is part of a kind of broader principle dedication in many trans communities to the concept of self-identification. And by taking an ethnographic perspective, I want to think not just about self-identification and its kind of ability to let people go outside of the traditional boundaries of gender and sex, but also really think about the cultural specificity of self-identification, self-definition, why we find these practices in communities now. And just to warn you, if it's not clear, there's going to be a lot of genital terminology to come, so get ready. I'm going to be saying all of it out loud. It's going to happen. So just to give you a kind of an overview of where I'm going to take you, I want to start out and just talk briefly about how we might theorize gender and embodiment, this concept of biological sex. Think about how other scholars of language have considered the way that verbal practices create usually normative concepts of sex. And then I'm going to be giving you this alternative, so I'm going to tell you a little bit about the context of my research, where I collected the data that I'll tell you about, and how in this particular community for an internet-mediated community for trans people, how trans bodies are sexed in that context. And that involves thinking about what kinds of conditions produce kind of successes when it comes to the goals of self-identification, and what kinds of conditions cause a breakdown in the power of self-identification. So there I'll talk about cultural context and also some of the limits of this concept of self-identification. And to do that, I'm going to bring in a little bit of theory from sociocultural linguistics, and how identity is theorized in ways that actually kind of have some friction with the way that members of this community think about identity. So like I said, to kind of start generally with the idea of just theorizing the relationship between gender and the body. Obviously, this was a major part of the post-structuralist queer critique, right? The idea that it's not just that gender is social and sex is biological, but that sex is also a social accomplishment. It's not strictly biological, it's not an objective categorization system, it's not universal across cultures or time. It has specific kind of, it exists in a specific time and place. And of course, queer theorists have kind of put forth this idea, most famously Butler, right? So early days of queer theory, the idea that sex is actually gender all along. And this is kind of the thinking that inspired me to look into linguistic practice and think more concretely, not just about the idea of sex as being discursively constructed, broadly speaking, kind of big D discourse, Foucauldian discourse, but also discursively constructed in terms of day-to-day language usage. So we don't just want to kind of stop at the idea, the theoretical idea that sex is constructed, and as somebody coming from a social scientific perspective, I really want to know how. How does this actually happen, and what kinds of conditions are required? So I'm going to try to, basically through giving you examples from the data that I've worked with, try to articulate an alternative trans theory of embodiment. And really I see the importance of language in the construction of trans identity as reflecting something really important about trans identity itself. It's not just about having certain kinds of body modifications or having certain kinds of gender presentations. It's also very fundamentally about the language that we use in reference to one another. So the naturalization of sex is sort of the starting point theoretically. Yeah.
I'm so sorry to interrupt. Is the mic working?
It is.
Oh,
Yeah. Should I use this?
I'm sorry.
No problem at all.
Thank you.
It's a two-pronged tripod. What's the name of that? Let's see. Oh, there we go. Okay. I guess I'll put that here so you can hear me. Okay. Is that all right? Yeah. Awesome. Thanks. So our starting point culturally is kind of with this idea that sex is a biological category, and this is actually a big part of what trans activism has tried to address. The idea that sex is something that's kind of out of our control, it's just a biological reality. What can we do about it? So what I'm looking at with these linguistic practices is essentially how are trans people responding to the naturalization of biological sex. And this, of course, is something that's very relevant currently, right? I mean, if you think about bathroom laws like the law in North Carolina, a lot of that has to do with thinking about biological sex, how biological sex works, who gets classified into what kinds of categories, and what kind of logic we use to make those classifications. I'm especially interested in the naturalization of, or responses to the naturalization of assigned sex in communities where trans people aren't necessarily pursuing genital surgery. Surgery is kind of its own domain for thinking about embodiment, but I'm really interested in what can happen even in the absence of physiological change and the power of language to institute its own kinds of changes. And this is actually part of a broader shift that we can see culturally, and I'll say more about this, a shift over time away from language that was once really common, so phrasing like female-bodied men in relation to trans men. There's actually an ethnography from the 90s by a trans anthropologist who uses, Jason Cromwell, who uses this phrase, female-bodied men, really consistently. What you find when you look at the data in the community that I work with, you find really strong resistance to the idea that transgender men should ever be described as female-bodied, regardless of what their bodies look like. So this is part of kind of a rise in the discourse of self-identification and the extension of that discourse, not just as a matter of, identifying with a particular gender category, but actually self-identifying what kind of body you have. And we'll return to that. So, in thinking about biological sex as a sociocultural construct, we really need to think about cross-historical and cross-cultural comparisons, because it's of course very easy when you're kind of imbricated with a particular cultural framework, a particular cultural context, to see, oh yeah, well, we have all of these good reasons that we can use to explain why biological sex works the way it does. But there are a number of sources of evidence that we can look to really emphasize that sex is, in fact, a cultural accomplishment. So first of all, there's just the physiological reality of the fact that biology does not create an even binary. We know that bodies exist that trouble the male-female sexual binary. It's also not unidimensional, right? As part of that, there's not a single scale for sex. There's hormones, there's physiology, internal reproductive organs, external genital organs, secondary sex characteristics, things that we do with our bodies kind of agentively. So sex is made up of a lot of different kind of layers of characteristics when we aren't necessarily applying this binary, sort of forced binary view. And of course, the forcing of a binary view is very literal in this sense, right? Bodies are changed in order to fit into one of those two categories. It's really a literal erasure of bodies that are outside of that easy binary. We also find, especially when we look at the way that intersex bodies that are sexually ambiguous, are seen in different kinds of cultural contexts. So there's great work on this by anthropologists like Gilbert Hurt, looking at kind of doing a comparative analysis between one particular type of intersex body that it's kind of there's a genetic basis for it, so there are certain populations that have higher rates than others of this particular form of embodiment, and he shows that in the Dominican Republic, this is seen as sort of fitting within the binary. People are able to say, okay, well, you're sort of born with one physiology, and then in adolescence, your physiology changes and you go to the other side of the binary. But Hurt's work in Papua New Guinea was focused on this community that also had high rates of this particular kind of embodiment, but who were kind of designated as members of a third gender, third sex category. There's also, to me, I think, the thing that probably just blew my mind the most as a member of a culture that uses a two-sex system is the fact that this was not always the way that Western medicine and science and just popular cultural ideas have seen sex. So historian Thomas LaCour has a fantastic book called Making Sex about the shift from a model of sex that really treated men and women as different points on a single continuum, in really messed up ways, right? I mean, women were seen as, having less vital energy than men, and therefore their reproductive organs didn't descend from their bodies. There are all kinds of problems with it, but it was really distinctly different from the way that medico-scientific discourses work today, where there's a clear distinction between different types of bodies. It was more like the continuum that we see between children and adults, right? We see, small children as versions of their adult sex. We don't say, oh, well, boys are one sex and men are another, even though there are huge physiological differences between prepubescent boys and adult men. So it was kind of more on that kind of scale rather than different categories. This is actually a point from a previous slide, so ignore that. But there's also the point that biological sex is changeable, right? And this is obviously the case, truer now than it ever has been. We have a lot of medical technologies and techniques that have been developed in order to shift people's physical sex characteristics. But it's also true that we all engage in practices that change our bodies, right? Our choices about things like what kind of food do we eat? What kind of exercise do we do? What do we do with our hair? Those are all things that are very closely tied up with physiological sex. And yet we clearly exert major influence over those aspects of embodiment. So one kind of important point here is that there's been kind of a split between the way that queer theorists in the 90s talked about the discursive construction of sex and how trans theorists, as part of the emergence of trans studies as a distinctive field of study, have responded to that perspective. So trans studies has been very much in the kind of materialist school of thought, right? And has said, okay, well that's all well and good, Judith Butler, to say that sex is discursively constructed, but look at the reality that trans people live. Discourse alone isn't going to get us out of the kinds of embodied oppression that trans people experience. So there's much more emphasis on the kind of lived reality of embodiment rather than kind of the high theory, abstract ideas about embodiment. But what I want to suggest is that language is actually an opportunity to tie these things together. It's how we create a link between the symbolic and the abstract and the fleshy reality that we deal with every day. So I see language as kind of existing in between and facilitating contact between the kind of the symbolic realm and the material realm. So hopefully I can reconcile that. Okay, so a little bit about how scholars have looked at biological sex and the role of language in constructing it, and for the most part this is looking at kind of normatively sexed bodies. So LaCour actually makes a little bit of a linguistic point. It's not the focus of his book, but he points out that in classical languages, when you look at medical texts, you don't find different terminology used for male and female bodies the way that you would today. So there wouldn't necessarily be a terminological distinction between ovaries and testes. They could both be referred to as gonads and were sort of seen as the same thing. So from really early on in the kind of historical trajectory that gets us to the communities I'm talking about, language was really key, right, from the very beginning. So there's a little bit of work looking at things like Deborah Cameron's 1992 piece on words for the penis, and she finds, kind of what you might expect, the idea that penises are being represented as weapons, as dangerous animals, as tools for doing certain kinds of things, or as kind of independent persons, almost like a separate subjectivity. There's also some work by Victoria Braun and Celia Kitzinger looking at mainly at dictionary definitions for genitals. So they find that penises are portrayed as active and vaginas as passive. Penises are presented as a kind of presence and vaginas as an absence. Penises exist for the function of penetrating, and vaginas exist primarily as a place to put a penis. So really clear reflections in these dictionary entries, which of course are, represented in an apolitical kind of way, right? These are just medical definitions of body parts. There's also some really nice recent research looking at the racialization of genitals. So Lucy McConey has a paper on South African college students and the terminology that they use to refer specifically to black men's genitals. And she finds that aggressive and dangerous wild animals are the most common kind of metaphor that shows up, but you also find weapons and size is an important kind of theme that shows up. One way to look at this is through a quote from Anne Foster Sterling, who points out that language can give us intellectual cataracts. But this is all kind of a depressing perspective to me, right? I mean, we have lots of evidence that things are messed up and oppressive, but I want to talk about potential ways to change that. So one potential challenge, and I think there can be a lot of potential challenges here, challenges from disability studies, from critical race studies, thinking about how normative embodiment can be, or normative ideas about embodiment can be oppressive. So there are a few ways that trans people kind of push us to challenge culturally dominant ideas about biological sex. So one question that arises is, where exactly is this line between a female body and a male body, right? We have categories, but we don't have well-articulated boundaries for those categories. There's also the question of which bodily characteristics actually matter for designating somebody as belonging to a specific sex, right? Do you have to have all of the characteristics lining up in exactly the way you would expect? Or are there particular categories that are more salient than others? For instance, most people don't get a genetic test done to find out what their sex chromosomes are. They sort of assume based on other characteristics, and obviously certain characteristics like genitals have a lot of salience. And then another question that comes along with this is how changeable sex is, right? And if you look at logic like that in transphobic bathroom laws, the idea there is that sex never changes, right? You're assigned a sex at birth, and that's, that goes on your paperwork. There's a lot of subtlety lost in discussion. I don't think I've heard people mention like people changing their birth certificates. I don't know that there's even awareness that that happens. But the basic logic is that once you have a certain kind of body, that's it. That's the sex category you're a member of. So the idea that trans models for biological sex allow for self-identification is kind of radical in a way. And as much as there's this shift in understanding that gender identity can be a matter of self-identification, this is actually something that if you kind of look at socialization happening in trans communities, this is often part of a socialization process of kind of letting go of the idea that medical authorities decide whether a body is female or male, and instead adopting this perspective that actually I can say about my own body how it's sexed and how it should be referred to. And as I mentioned, really importantly, surgery is in no way required for self-identification to take place. If anything, it's more important to people who aren't necessarily having surgery. So the logic here is just that a male body is the body of a self-identified male person. a female body is the body of a self-identified female person. And importantly, even in cases where people are pursuing medical interventions like surgery, the physical changes that happen really don't have clear meaning in the absence of language, right? I mean, this is essentially the distinction between medical mastectomy and male chest reconstruction, which is the term used for trans men's chest surgery, right? There can be a lot of similarities, not complete overlap, but a lot of similarities in the medical approach, but it's a very different kind of outcome in terms of how people understand their bodies. And similarly, I was recently at a trans studies conference, and somebody asked a question about how people experience genitals after having genital surgery, and people were sort of pointing out that, women, trans women who have vaginoplasties don't usually talk about their genitals as being like inverted penises, say, right? They talk about them as being vaginas. So that kind of framing linguistically is not necessarily a given, but obviously is an opportunity for kind of self-empowerment or the refusal to validate somebody if you're talking about someone else's body. So there's kind of a conventional approach to genital semantics that I think is useful to think through to see about, when we're talking about what trans people do with the semantics, the meaning of genital terminology. So this is a couple of examples from American Heritage Dictionary, pretty typical examples. So we get definitions like this: a vagina as the passage leading from the opening of the vulva to the cervix of the uterus in female mammals. Penis, the male organ of copulation in higher vertebrates, homologous with the clitoris. That's actually unusual to define penises in terms of clitorises. In mammals, it also serves as the male organ of urinary excretion. So basically, we have two elements here. We have kind of the structure and function of the body part itself, right? It's a passage that leads from one place to another. It's an organ of copulation, excretion. And then we have this sex gender kind of meaning that is also incorporated there. And essentially what we see trans people in the community that I'm about to tell you about doing is separating these elements of the semantics and selectively employing one or the other depending on context. Okay, so the data and the analysis, I'll just tell you a little bit about this. So I specifically, I don't mention this here, but I specifically want to think about tactics used to sex trans men's bodies, especially in the absence of surgical intervention. So the data come from this very active online community for trans men. That says 200 exclamation point from 2001. It was active, or actually I think it was 2000. Yeah, active from 2000 to 2015, although mostly popular from 2004 to 2010. There were several thousand members, changing over time, but at any given time about a couple thousand. And in total, there are over 3,900 days of posts, 7,200 tokens of words that refer to genitals. I'm still coding this larger set, so I'm going to talk to you about 2,300 or so of these tokens. And importantly, the majority of members, at least the majority of the active members in this community, had not had surgical interventions, and in most cases weren't seeking them. But most of the active members either made use of hormone therapy or planned to make use of hormone therapy, and that's important because it's well known that testosterone causes genital growth. So that's part of what's going on here, and I'll point out where that comes up. Body talk is really common in this community. It comes up in people talking about medical issues. People often seek medical advice in this community, and also discussions of sex and discussions of self-esteem. And we'll see examples of each of those. Most importantly, in this community, in great contrast, as I said, from communities that I saw myself in the 1990s, it's seen as really problematic, at least on the part of the most active community members who kind of set the agenda in a way, to suggest that a trans man's genitals or body could be described as female. And there was actually this really interesting, can't quite see the bottom line, there was this really interesting kind of blow up in the community where somebody came in who had kind of been away from the trans community for a number of years, so their last contact was in the 1990s, they came back and started using some of the terminology that they had been exposed to at that time, and people were just livid about it. I mean, it was a huge flame war, and it was really based on this kind of different contextualization of what kinds of words are appropriate. So this is clearly something that has shifted over time. So to tell you a little bit about the results from this subset of the data, so the norm in this community is to use traditionally male terminology. So especially vernacular, kind of non-scientific terminology like dick and cock. Those are two of the most common words. So that's this huge slice of pink here. The second most common type of language was ambiguous. So for phrases like privates or down there, kind of euphemistic language, that's the orange slice of the pie. We also, though, find a number of traditionally female terms, and these include both the kind of medicalized terms like vagina, clitoris, but also vernacular terms like pussy or cunt. And that's the purple bit here. And then we have explicit blends, so that just makes up that tiny little sliver. So words that intentionally combine a term that's gendered in one way with another term that's gendered in another way. So boy cunt, man pussy, those are the most common examples of those blends. And importantly, these strategies can be used by the same speakers. So somebody might use a traditionally male term in one moment, and then in the next sentence use a traditionally female term. And physiology really has nothing to do with it. You can find really similar kinds of strategies among people who haven't had genital surgery or people who have been on hormones, people who haven't been on hormones. There's one exception to that, which I'll come back to at the end. So I want to show you some examples of each of these types of usage to kind of get a sense of why we find this kind of variation, right? I mean, obviously male terms are more common, but there are really quite a few cases where people are using traditionally female terms. So what can we make of that? Well, as I said, male terminology is the default. And in this case, speakers are, as I said, decoupling the physiological component from the gendered component. And in this case, they're just using the gendered component, right? So the definition of a dick is that it is a genital body part on a self-identified man, right? There isn't a physiological commonality that needs to exist to use that word. It's enough that the person you're talking about identifies as male. Right, so it's defined by its gender. Of course, people do recognize that there are some differences between kind of a typical non-trans man's genitals and a typical trans man's genitals, but it's framed primarily as a matter of size, a difference in size rather than type. And as I mentioned, the kind of the effect of genital growth from testosterone is really important because it does tend to put trans men's bodies kind of in somewhere on a continuum between a traditional penis and a traditional clitoris. So there is kind of some physiological stuff happening here, but these strategies can be used by people who aren't on hormones. So one kind of piece of linguistic evidence that we see for the fact that trans men in this community are fundamentally treating their bodies as the same as non-trans men's bodies is the way that people in the community talk about non-trans men and their body parts. And specifically, they're always marked specifically as non-trans. So examples like this, I can't say that I have a lot of experience holding and feeling non-trans dicks. And I'm not sure, maybe you can't see, yeah, you can't really see the bottom line, but it was a question, somebody asking, do you have much experience with factory direct dicks? Factory direct is a common little jokey phrase to talk about surgically unmodified bodies. So they're not just saying dicks, right, because that would include trans men's bodies at all. They're specifically talking about their experience with non-trans men's dicks. So when then do we find uses of traditionally female terminology? As I mentioned, you find both the medicalized terms and the vernacular terms, so we want to think about why that difference shows up in comparison with the traditionally male terminology, where you really don't find penis being used in the ways that dick and cock are used. So importantly, the fact that people are using traditionally female terminology does not mean that they sort of concede that their genitals are female. In fact, a lot of the people who use these terms will be actively describing themselves as male body, as having a male body, or having male genitals. Here, what we're saying is just the reverse of what we saw with male terminology. So instead of thinking about the gendered meaning of words like vagina, there's an emphasis just on the physiological element. So vaginas have something in common physiologically, but they don't necessarily only occur on the bodies of women. And you might think that there's no real way to avoid female terms if you're talking about internal genitals, say, but in fact a lot of trans men never make use of female terminology to talk about their bodies, and there are trans community specific alternatives. So the word front hole is a popular term that people often use even in like medical surveys for trans people if they're using trans sensitive terminology. So there are alternatives, and then there are, of course, the euphemistic and not kind of ambiguous terms that I mentioned before. So there are three primary contexts where we can find traditionally female genital terminology. One of these is in technical talk about bodies. I'll show you examples of each. The second is in talk about genital dysphoria, dysphoria being the term for discomfort or unhappiness with one's sexual embodiment. Or how one is perceived. And then we also find talk about sex, as in sexuality, not biological sex, is another place where we find the use of some of these traditionally female terms. So to take the first example, I'll give you a few examples here. So somebody in example one is describing how a phalloplasty is done, which is one of the options for female to male genital surgery, and they're saying that when performing a phalloplasty, other surgeons leave the vagina, which is to say the vaginal opening, not the vulva in its entirety, which is then located behind the scrotum. And two, we have somebody talking about getting a medical procedure that he's not very happy about. He says, I'm supposed to get a transvaginal ultrasound of my uterus, and I've been putting it off like crazy. In example 3, so I read up on stuff like hysterectomy and vaginectomy, like they can remove all that stuff, the ovaries, uterus, vagina, etc. These are all as they originally appeared, so typos abound. And then finally, we have a case where somebody's actually not talking about genital surgery or about gynecological care, but actually is talking about a piercing. So this person is saying that since triangle piercings are positioned behind the clitoral shaft, any growth you've got from being on T, the abbreviation for testosterone that a lot of trans people use, may limit whether there's enough room for the piercing. So there are a few strategies going on here. One of these is that we find medical or technical terminology in these quotes. So it's not very common to see people talk about, when performing a phalloplasty, surgeons leave the front hole, right? That's not super common. Rarely do we see vernacular terms here. We also see some examples, some instances of kind of depersonalization happening here, right? We're talking about the vagina and the clitoris, not necessarily your vagina or your clitoris. And a big part of this bodily self-identification is that you can use whatever terms you want to refer to your own body, but when you start applying words to other bodies, you have to change your approach, essentially, or at least think about it a little bit differently. And then, if we wanted to kind of interpret these uses of these terms, we might think, okay, well, maybe there's kind of a practicality element, right? If you're having surgery described to you and you want to go and talk to a doctor about the surgery, it's helpful to know what kinds of terms the doctor might use. Or it could be that there's something about medical authority here, right? And that these are seen as in some way technically correct in a way that's relevant for talking about medical procedures. And we'll return to that kind of idea later on to see if we can get a better answer to that question of whether this is just about practicality or not. So the second context I mentioned is in talk about dysphoria. So a few examples here, somebody saying, I'm not the only one that is filled with immense hatred over his vagina, am I? I feel utter revulsion toward my vagina. I hate the idea of vaginal/anal mine penetration. And I try to explain that I'm not a virgin, I just never had vagina sex before because I'm just not comfortable with that. So we find some slightly different approaches, different strategies here. I think to interpret this, we have to think about the fact that these aren't just people who are uncomfortable with the physiological part they have. What's more deeply uncomfortable is how those body parts are gendered, right? So the use of female terminology can be seen kind of as an icon, as a representation of the gendered part of that meaning that is producing much of the strife here. You also find some evidence that people are kind of mitigating the gender implications here. So in the first example, we have somebody speaking kind of generically, but saying, I'm not the only one filled with immense hatred over his vagina, right? We might expect to see another word there. It could be phrased a little differently, and you could say, I feel hatred toward my vagina, or do any of you feel hatred toward your vaginas? Or you could use the generic singular they, which would be common, and so any filled with immense hatred over their vagina. All of those are options, but the speaker very specifically marks that this is a man's vagina. This isn't just any vagina. And you also find some kind of unusual phraseology, right? So I hate the idea of vaginal anal mine penetration, kind of an unusual way to say that, not having my vagina penetrated, but just this broad concept, and oh yeah, by the way, it's mine that we're talking about. And similarly, we have, I just never had vagina sex, also kind of an unusual phrasing, and you also have the scare quotes there as well, right, indicating some kind of discomfort or dubiousness about that word. Okay, and then the final context that we have, and I'll give you some new examples that kind of fit into this as well. So in talking about sex, we have things like this. So we have somebody saying, last night this is a typo, I had my cunt penetrated for the first time since my colposcopy, which is a medical procedure. I enjoy my muscles, more masculine build and face and body hair as much as I enjoy my tits and cunt. I've been thinking a lot about being viewed as a fetish, essentially a, quote, dude with a pussy. So here we're finding vernacular terms are more common than technical terms. People don't usually use the word vagina, for instance, when talking about, especially if they're talking about positive sexual experiences, kind of presenting it in this erotic context, as opposed to saying, I had vaginal sex and then I had, then I had a UTI and had to go to the doctor, right? So where it's also kind of about the medical side of things. These are often making reference to positive experiences with the body parts that are being talked about, but not always, right? We have this third example where someone is kind of concerned with the way that they're being sexualized. So it's sexualization, and it might be erotic for the person who's viewing them as a dude for a pussy, but it's unwelcome on the part of the speaker. But I think that we can think about reclaiming this language in contexts where we do have people talking about positive sexual experiences that involve these body parts as, again, kind of an icon for reclaiming the body parts themselves, right? So it's part of a general kind of reframing of these body parts that are so often a source of discomfort, of dysphoria, of rejection, reframing them as something that is erotic and can be eroticized, and that it doesn't necessarily have to involve erasing the differences that exist in trans bodies. Okay, so some more examples that I think are also illuminating. So I've done some work with my colleague, a linguistic anthropologist, Elijah Edelman, where we looked at some other data sources, including Craigslist ads. And just to warn you, this is going to be especially graphic, explicit stuff, as you might imagine. So I'll just show you some examples of the way people are using terms in these are ads written by people identifying themselves as trans men or as FTM. So we have somebody describing themselves, I'm sexy, short, mixed with a thick ass and thighs, tight pussy. There's some more text, and then they're requesting pound my pussy from behind, or I can ride. This, I think, was a subject line, all caps, right? Are you a hot, horny guy ready to screw pussy now of a FTM? We have somebody saying, again, the all caps are there originally, I want my pussy eaten. my huge clit suck, fucked for hours. This is again a description of a person, trans FTM, pre-op cunt with a large clit, post-chest, post-op chest, pretty and boyish. So we have clearly more examples of the vernacular term showing up here, right? Not as often finding words like vagina. And actually, interestingly, you also find the use of the word clit, which is really uncommon within trans communities. You'd be much more likely to hear somebody talk about their dick or cock, or maybe a blend of the terms. Dicklet is sometimes used as a blend, although even that can be problematized by some folks. We also do find other examples of trans-specific language being used, so mostly this phrase front hole. So this person is describing themselves. They mentioned that front hole stuff's good with me, meaning that they're open to using that part of their body sexually. And somebody else saying that they don't do anal, but gladly take it in their front hole. And when we do find traditionally male terminology, it's actually more likely to be in reference to the desired partner that someone is seeking with this personal ad. So in my work with Elijah, we've thought about, why is it that we find these kinds of terms showing up in personal ads? And, I think there's something to the logic that I just provided, the idea that we're seeing people kind of reclaim the use of the body parts that they're maybe expected to be uncomfortable with, and with that reclaim the language. There's also, to some degree, some expediency going on here, right? You might want, if you're looking for a hookup, you might not want to filter out people who don't know what a front hole is, right? So it may just be that in this context, this is more practical as a way to be understood and find responses to the ad. But there's also something going on in these ads in general with the way that people are sexualizing their own bodies and kind of marketing themselves, and specifically how people are presenting their bodily difference. We wouldn't necessarily expect to find people emphasizing, that they want their pussy eaten or fucked, right? These are not necessarily stereotypes of trans men's sexuality for those of us with enough contact to have stereotypes of that sort. What my colleague and I have been thinking about is the kind of homonormative aspects of personal ads in the men seeking men kind of context in particular. And how there's kind of this logic that has shown up in a lot of work on language and homonormativity on the idea of flexible pleasure. The idea that a homonormative subject is not constrained by roles like top or bottom, for instance, but pursues what is pleasurable to them as an individual. So that's not necessarily a descriptive reality, but that's sort of the idealized version of this versatile, sexually versatile homonormative subject. So the bodily differences that these speakers have to engage with in order to post ads of this sort could be something to be mitigated, right? It could be, by the way, I do have this body part, but don't worry about that, it's not really going to be relevant to you. Or just sort of glossing over it using general language without really naming what they're talking about. But what we find instead is that people are actually emphasizing their bodily difference as an additional potential source of pleasure, not just for themselves, but also for their potential mate. So there's a way in which these kinds of non-normative bodies, by using some of the discourses of homonormativity, can kind of enter some of those spaces of sexualized homonormativity and take on a kind of embodied value, sexual value, that wouldn't necessarily be there in most kind of normative sexual constructs or systems. Okay, so to think about the cultural context of self-identification, I kind of want to give it a broader framing than I have. So gender self-identification, and sometimes self-determination, self-definition, is really at the center of most trans activism in the US in the latter decades of the 20th century. And as I suggested, this is something that's expanding even in recent years. So on the one hand, this is really clearly has a lot of empowering potential, right? That people can name their own terms that they can select what words others use in reference to their body. And by the way, this isn't something specific to trans people, right? I mean, this is actually something that people are, who sort of move across kinds of political communities have been trying to introduce this as a practice for everyone, right? Most people have preferences about which words they want used to apply to their bodies and what words might be a little bit uncomfortable or unwanted or considered derogatory. So this isn't specific to trans people in any way, but as an alternative to both the genital-based system where, you know, if you're born with a penis, then you're male, and as an alternative to kind of older models of trans identity where you had to present certain kinds of characteristics in order to be granted access to medical care or even you know, legal paperwork to transition in an official way. It's clearly a more empowering option than either of those. It's also a really distinctly neoliberal approach to identity work, that it's about the individual. It's about individual self-determination. So the individual is the ultimate authority, in this case, on their own identity. And as part of this, you know, we're not just talking about language, but we're saying each individual should be free to choose how they're referred to, what kinds of medical procedures, if any, they want to make use of as part of a transition, how they transition, right? Whether they make legal changes or just social changes or medical changes. Borrowing some of the work that Butler did in the late 90s talking about identity as an object, we can really see that, you know, in this framework, one's identity is an object to be discovered and known, and that has a certain reality to it that only that individual has access to. But importantly, speakers can't do this kind of work alone, right? You can't just make up entirely new terminology and expect it to be understood. There needs to be some kind of anchor to other humans, because that's how language works. So some limits to self-identification are important. I think we can view the Craigslist ads that I showed you as kind of success stories, because these are people who are using some of these strategies of bodily self-presentation, and they're doing it in ways that, you know, allow them to get responses to their Craigslist ads, right? My colleague actually did some great interviews with some of the posters of these kinds of ads and got to talk to them about the response, and it's usually quite a positive response. I mean, obviously not everyone reading an ad is going to respond positively, but there doesn't seem to be any shortage of people who see these words and are just like, yeah, let's do it. So those are successful, at least to some extent. But if we were to think about contexts in which linguistic self-determination is less possible, I mean, we could think about the doctor's office, right? Who owns language in the doctor's office? Do trans patients really get to say, these are the words that you're going to use for me when you're talking about my body? Some doctors invite that, but it's certainly not the norm. You know, in institutions like prison or hospitals or detention centers, these are all cases where agency is limited in a way that extends to linguistic agency. Of course, one can always use, you know, one always has a certain degree of agency over the words that we use ourselves, but whether we can extend that agency to apply to other people is really the question. I wanted to come back to this issue I mentioned earlier about the idea of legitimizing medical science. So on the one hand, members of this community draw on medical scientific knowledge. For instance, in talking about the continuum between penises and clitorises, people are very aware that those structures develop from the same structure natally or prenatally, and regularly invoke this kind of medical fact, right, that there is a continuum. But at the same time, this kind of acceptance of support from medical discourses might bring some problematic elements to it as well. And when you see the word penis show up, I think that's probably the clearest example of this. It's really used almost exclusively to talk about people who have had genital surgery. So genital surgery can give access to a penis, but genital surgery isn't necessary to give access to a cock. And that's not to say that no trans men use penis in reference to unmodified genitals. but it's certainly much, much less frequent. Another question that we might want to think about is whether self-identification has some potential in it for abuse, or at least to be used in ways that are politically contrary to their kind of original life in trans communities. So for instance, the word cisgender, used in reference to people who are not trans, is a word that people respond to differently. And there are some people who really don't like being called cisgender, even though they kind of acknowledge that, you know, they meet the definition, they identify with the gender that they were assigned at birth, but they don't identify as cisgender. A little like, you know, white people not identifying as white, right? So under the plain logic of self-identification, that's legit, right? Oh yeah, of course, you're not cisgender if you don't identify as cisgender. What if somebody's identity was, well, I'm a real man, that's how I self-identify, an actual real man? That wouldn't go over very well either. So clearly self-identification is a little bit more complex than its initial definition would suggest. And you can actually also think about, there was the recent example of a student at U of M, do I need to pause for booing? I don't know. A student at U of M who selected a pronoun. They now have an assistant for students to select their own pronouns. And he selected Your Majesty as his preferred pronoun, which, at least from the coverage I read, did not appear to be a legitimate, a true request based on the fact that he feels good when he's referred to that way and does not feel good when he's referred to in other ways. Notably, none of the articles used Your Majesty, or, I'm not using it in reference to him either. But, clearly these are cases of, at minimum, self-identification being taken in directions that it was never really intended to be taken. So I think that a good way to kind of help us deal with this tension is to think about the way that identity is understood by sociocultural linguists like Mary Buckles and Kira Hall, who developed this framework, the tactics of intersubjectivity. And essentially this is kind of a set of resources that are a set of strategies rather that people use in constructing themselves and others. And there are a few especially important points about identity as it's seen in this model. So specifically, identity is collaborative. It's intersubjective, right? It's co-constructed. It's not just something that the speaker does on their own. Meaning, because it's a product of discursive interaction, can't be predetermined by the speaker. Speakers have certain ideas of what they mean, but listeners may have very different ideas about what they mean. So if we think about identity not just as a matter of self-identification, but as a collaborative process, it kind of shifts the perspective that we take on agency as well. So identity isn't actually purely a process of individual agency, right? It's an opportunity for intersubjective agency. So it really implicates not just the person who is self-identifying, but everyone they are self-identifying to as part of this process. That's certainly what we see when we look at this Craigslist data, and there's actually a few other really interesting sources of data like it. A few of my colleagues have looked at things like XTube, I think it's like amateur porn videos, so people upload pictures and videos of themselves, and then other people can comment on them. So that's another context where we find these very similar kinds of linguistic strategies, and you can really see right there what is the response that people are taking to this. And in those cases, especially in the cases of homonormative sexual markets, there's this piece of, what's at stake for the interlocutor, right? What's at stake for the cisgender gay man, for instance, who is responding to a personal ad or commenting on a video produced by a trans man. And in those cases, there's a real alignment, right? Both the trans man who is describing himself as male or as masculine, whatever kind of identity labels might be used, has a certain stake in representing themselves as a member of the gender they identify with. And to the extent that we're talking about people who identify specifically as male, gay men who are interested in them also have some identity stakes in seeing them as male. So overall, I think that a discourse of collaborative agency, well, it provides more insight into the process academically, but it also just recognizes that we all have a role, and I think therefore responsibility, at least a responsibility to be careful as we construct one another's identities. This perspective is also important, I think, because it recognizes that language is really one of the most basic levels on which we do identity work and on which we affirm or don't affirm other people's identities. So I see these kinds of ideas about expanding self-identification as not just kind of an academic exercise for understanding what's happening at a linguistic level, but really as important building blocks for thinking about the role of language and moral responsibility in the pursuit of trans inclusion and trans justice. Thank you.
We have time for questions.
Are you familiar with the pushback against Buck Angel's response to Trump? That kept coming up in terms of, so for context, Buck Angel is a trans man porn performer, and he posted a picture that's very, very, very masculine, very conventionally masculine. He posted a picture of himself shirtless that said, "Hey, Trump, grab my pussy, I dare you." And there was a big pushback to that, and I'm wondering, what do you think was happening linguistically in that conversation?
I think part of that has to do with the kind of response to Buck Angel's language in general. So this was one particular example. It's actually an example where he is at least talking about his own body, right? But I actually met a grad student at this trans studies conference I was just at last month who was analyzing his documentary, Sexing the Trans Man. And basically the documentary is about, you know, how do trans men feel about their genitals from a sexual perspective, from an identity perspective. And at times he sort of creates space for people to use their own language, but he also very regularly uses the word pussy specifically, or vagina sometimes, to talk about other people's bodies. And he actually, I mean, it's kind of a weird disconnect where overtly he's saying, oh yeah, call your body whatever you want, but then when you really look at what he's doing, he's not allowing for that in every instance. So yeah, I think it's really about the way that Buck Angel is at least perceived as labeling other people's bodies and not just his own. I mean, it also has to do with probably out of the terms that, I mean, it might be like the most loaded term that could be used too, because it has this very specific life in heterosexual dynamics, and you know, it's also it's a diminutive in a way kind of phrase. So there's that. I think just the word itself is less popular than if he had just been saying vagina, for instance. And then I think the other piece of that is that he's a public figure, right? So even when he's using words to describe himself, if somebody, you know, Buck Angel is the only trans man that you've ever heard talking, you might think, oh, okay, that's the language that trans men use. So it's kind of an issue of representation that is always an issue, right? When there are just, you know, one or two, a few people who are kind of stand-ins for an entire community, it's easy to assume that their experience is going to represent everybody. Great question.
Thank you, that was a really wonderful talk. This is going to be an extremely geeky question.
Good.
Your data set is huge. Could you talk a little more about your coding process?
Yeah, so the original analysis was a much smaller data set. It was only a month's worth of posts, and that's where most of my examples come from. So I'm using some methods of corpus linguistics to do this. So basically I have a corpus that just consists of downloaded HTML files from this community, and I use a software program called AntConc, which allows keyword searches, and you can look at you know, what words tend to occur next to each other. So mostly these are, I guess what I talked about today was purely based on keyword searches, just within the data set. So I first identify instances, and then the coding also involves looking at who is being referred to, right? Because a lot of genital terms are not actually in reference to a trans person or not in reference to a specific person at all. So that's another piece, and then a few other things like, are we talking about internal versus external genitals? And I didn't show you, but the breakdown of, you look at that within the traditionally female terms, you find a lot of references to internal genitals, but clitoris, for instance, is very uncommon, which is probably related to the easy alternative of dick and cock to refer to that body part. So yeah, it's a pretty simple coding process in that sense, but it takes a little bit of extra investigation to figure out, okay, who is this person talking about, to get the context right and all of that. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you. I'm interested in your talk about the collaborative identity and intersubjective agency in relation to teams-based work, which is more talking about that capital discourse and legal ramification.
Sorry, can you speak up a little?
Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
Do you think that this intersubjective agency and collaborative work can be transformed to impact legal or larger institutional ramifications for life chances for trans people? Or like, how do you see this connecting? Because you talk about this connection with theory and the material. And how do you see this also translating to like larger discourses?
That's a great question. I think because of the fact that this is really steeped in this neoliberal model of selfhood, that it would be really hard to introduce a collective model to the very structures that are sort of creating this neoliberal discourse, right? I mean, so people have been very successful. To the extent that people have been successful in reforming legal systems, it's always been based on this neoliberal logic that, well, the U.S. government values individual self-determination, so you have to allow for this if you're going to value that. I mean, there's work by people like Dean Spade doing, pretty great stuff with legal discourse and finding ways to problematize the basic assumptions of like what trans equality even means. But yeah, that's a big challenge. I don't know that I have a solution to that. There's also some interesting work by Christopher Hutton, who's a scholar of language and law, and he talks about a recent case in Hong Kong, or within the last few years, of a trans woman whose marriage was challenged after her husband died. And so there's some really interesting stuff happening there where the legal system's understanding of what sex is actually hugely contradictory. It starts out claiming to be a descriptive category, but then it becomes a prescriptive category. So that's another issue too, is that when you have these inconsistencies in even how we're defining the legal category itself, that you run up against problems. I think probably the more radical way to approach it would be to do things like getting rid of gender classification by institutional bodies. Yeah.
So I'm wondering, this came up during the Craigslist project, and I'm wondering if you distinguish between trans men and trans masculine people.
I use the labels that people use for themselves, and actually it was interestingly, specifically in the Craigslist ads, there were very few cases where people were using language other than trans man or FTM. Those were kind of the key terms. And actually, in the interviews that Elijah did, he found that I think he interviewed people who identified as trans men, but very few of the people who had posted using the word FTM actually identified as FTM. So there probably is a certain degree of expediency going on where, you want your search term to work, right? And FTM seems like it might be sort of a default search term on Craigslist, so it shows up in almost every ad of that sort. That said, in terms of just the broader issue of self-identification, it seemed like there were actually a lot of commonalities across binary and non-binary identified folks in terms of just the emphasis on self-determination, self-identification. In other research that I've done, I've definitely found that non-binary people are less insistent or kind of maybe less consistent in demanding one specific kind of sex reading of their bodies, which as you would expect if you have a non-binary identity. But it's still about I get to name it, right? Whatever it should be. Good question.
It was a terrific talk. Thank you very much for coming to give it. And all the work you're doing. This is a bit of a follow-up to that, and to the other questions around this issue of self-identification. which for what it's worth, I would suggest is liberal. It's a liberalism problem. Neoliberalism intensifies it, but
Yeah.
it has some really deep roots.
True. Yes.
Do you think, can you say more about, you made references to other cultures that don't have binary systems, which I think most of us are aware of. I would say some of those cultures exist as subcultures in the United States also.
Yeah.
And so I was wondering about how you're understanding the specificity of this work. And so I have a couple of questions. One is, can you say something about what the race and class makeup of this group is? Because we didn't hear anything about that. And then also, how generalizable do you think the patterns are that you're finding? Because I kept having like more, bolder thoughts about about what happened to the term queer. Right? And you can see a very similar kind of trajectory where it emerges as this resistant mode of self-identification, of communal identification, and then it gets completely domesticated. And then so we regenerate. And this would be, to put it theoretically, this is along the lines of Robin Weedman's readings of what's happening around identity studies itself. So the states could be part of it. But it's about the specificity of how you would talk about that stuff, historically and various cultures.
Yeah, so as, to start with the first part about what else we know about these individuals, the main online community, unfortunately, there's really no compendium of any sort of people self-identifying aside from being in this community and anything they might say in their posts. So it's an issue that comes up for sure, largely in critical ways, sort of in terms of certain voices having a lot more of a presence in this community than others, but unfortunately I can't put any kind of coding to that. As far as generalizability, that's really interesting. I think there probably are kind of multiple things going on. One is this sort of constant shifting of the goalpost, right? And I think you see that a lot, especially when it comes to things like umbrella terms for trans, right? Transgender was supposed to be an umbrella term, but then it came to mean a specific type of transgender identity, and then trans was an umbrella term, and that came to refer to a specific type of trans identity, and then trans star was a term, and then people don't like trans star anymore, so I think we're back to trans. But yeah, there is this kind of broader process that happens, especially with appropriation and the fact that you can start out with something that's really radical, but in the uptake of that, it might be completely defanged and turned into a demographic category that corporations use to be promoted. That said, I do think that there's something more specific going on because it's something that has changed so much in the last, less than 20 years, really. So I see this as actually part of a gradual expansion of this discourse, and you can see something similar happening with pronouns. So, 20 years ago, the way trans people talked about pronouns was actually pretty similar to the way that cisgender people talk about pronouns. If you're a woman, the pronoun is she. If you're a man, the pronoun is he. And there were, small pockets of people kind of pushing back against that, but it certainly wasn't expected that you would ask a trans person what pronoun you should use to refer to them, and it would be considered rude in a lot of those communities to do so. But now people talk about pronouns as actually completely separate from identity, right? You have your gender identity, and then you have your pronouns, which may or may not align in the expected way. So it's kind of, to me, a like fracturing of the language of identity into these multiple layers that can be detached from one another and manipulated. So yeah, I'll have to think about that more though. I think.
Well, no, I think the use of expansion and fracturing are both really just and seem to set different kinds of objectives.
Yeah, thank you for that question. Interesting stuff to think about. Yeah.
Related to that, like Dean Spade and a lot of other people have commented that one of the things that's beautiful about trans communities is that our language is different from place to place, that it's shifting, that it's evolving, and situated. And I'm wondering like how much you see that flux still happening, or is it starting to become more settled? Is it still something that is like a resistant practice, and then also as like a trans scholar in trans studies, what do you think about what it means to kind of bring this into the academy and contribute to the institutionalization of it all? Like every time I have to define these terms for my students, there's a part of me that just feels like I'm contributing to a settling that I am very unsettled by.
Yeah, I think the expansion of self-identification is in part to try to rein in those differences and create a commonly shared logic that could apply to any community, no matter what language they use. I'm thinking about David Valentine's book, Imagining Transgender, too, as you're talking about trans studies and institutionalization. And a lot of the problematic discourses that he identifies in trans communities in the 90s, today the response would be, well, self-identification, so don't worry about it. It's okay if a person identifies as a trans woman and as gay because she's attracted to men. That's acceptable. The extent to which that works, though, I think is more of an open question, right? Because there's certain types of self-identification are more intelligible than others in certain communities. And it's, you know, as much as people talk about self-identification, there's certainly resistance within trans communities that a person really can't identify in any way that they want. For instance, I did an interview maybe a year ago with 2 people whose pronouns are pony. And so I was talking to them about what it's like to have pony as their pronoun and how little acceptance that receives in any community, because it's not, people don't know what to make of it, it seems like a lot of work, basically the same arguments that people make about trans pronouns in general, right? So yeah, to a certain extent, I think the discourse of self-identification can hide a lot of what's happening and the unequal access that people have to self-identification. I do think that the trans community has certain types of cohesiveness that are distinct to the trans community. You know, the early adoption of technological forms of connecting, I think, is really important. So I would imagine that that does have some effect too on what kinds of diversity we see across different trans communities. And of course, you know, from a global perspective, you can now see these discourses traveling much further and getting picked up in very different kinds of ways. So that's another kind of piece of it. The institutionalization of the subject is, yeah, of course, always a challenge. And, you know, talking about these subjects with a group of trans people versus with a group of, you know, academics is a totally different conversation. I see a lot of what I do as sort of taking things, or at least trying to take things that trans people all know, and translating them in a way that shows why they're important, both on a political level and on an academic level. So yeah, I kind of, you know, I have my hopes that I'm doing it in a way that's at least a little subversive, or you know. And of course, it's a double-sided issue, because on the one hand, you want students talking about trans issues, and you want them to have a vocabulary to do that, and especially to have a respectful vocabulary to do that. But it does require basically a different perspective on how language works, right? You have to challenge, you know, language ideologies like there is a correct way to speak a language, or there is a correct definition for any term. So I also like to think that linguistics as a field that is focused on unseating some of those ideologies can play an important role in allowing people who are not insiders to understand that language is both a powerful and a delicate thing.
Thank you.
Thank you. I was thinking about, this is a kind of a follow-up to the last few questions that I've gotten, but and it's more about how not necessarily non-trans people, but just the discourse of transness, right? And maybe even in an academic kind of setting. So I was thinking about the notion of preference. I was thinking about in particular like the pronoun question, like, and 2 ways of phrasing that. Which pronoun do you prefer to be called by versus which pronoun do you identify with, right? Or something like that, a sort of distinction like that between preference and identification. And I wonder if does that matter? Like, is there a shift in the language of preference? Because I'm also thinking about like sexual preference versus sexual orientation versus, and how the idea of preference versus other ways of expressing what you're talking about regarding sexuality. Maybe there's a relationship there, but is that a meaningful difference? Is it problematic to talk about preference within, if the framework is self-identification? And is that a salient difference within the community either, right? Do you see what I'm saying?
Yeah, definitely.
And maybe that gets into issues of desire, a different way of thinking about desire.
Yeah, I hadn't thought about the connection to sexual preference, but that's got to be part of it, right? Is the idea that preference is sort of, what's the word? Frivolous, right?
Yeah.
It doesn't convey the same meaning, or at least that other words might. I think as soon as people started using the phrase preferred pronouns, people started critiquing it. I don't think there was even a gap there. It was just immediate. And it presents another kind of, I mean, it's a practical challenge, right? Because the phrasing that you most hear in trans communities that make a habit of asking that question is, what are your pronouns? Or what pronouns do you use? Which is kind of funny because like I don't actually use he or refer to myself, I usually use I or me. But if you know what that means, then you know that's what people are saying. If you're unfamiliar with the concept of people even giving their pronouns, just saying what pronouns do you use can be a really difficult question to parse. So I think context is really important there. I'm always trying to find ways out of saying preference, and there are a number of things that people can do. It is definitely seen as problematic by a lot of people, but there are also trans people who use the phrase preferred pronouns and don't have a problem with it. So.
Yeah, I was thinking also about how this plays out in situations where actually you're talking about the body too, and particularly in like situations of sexual encounter maybe, which would be sort of the follow-up to the Craigslist postings, like, and how that plays out when one isn't sure what I'll use the term preferred, but what the language is that one uses to refer to self, right?
Yeah, I think.
Like, how is that there's a negotiation there? This is the same with non-trans people as well, right?
Yeah, I haven't actually heard about people talk about the word preference in those contexts. It seems like it's easier to avoid in a way than with pronouns. You can just say like, what should I call this, right? What word should I use for that? What do you call this body part? But I think that if somebody, I could see somebody having that critique for sure, especially depending on kind of the dynamic between people. Craigslist ads actually seem, I would doubt that a lot of the people who are responding to these ads will ask, what word should I use to refer to your body, because they've already presented words.
Yeah, right.
So there's probably going to be an assumption that those are the words to use, even though actually that might not be what the person likes to have used in reference to their body. That's the kind of sentence you have to come up with too, right? The words that the person wants to have used in reference to their body. It takes a little bit of work. I think it's worth it, but it does take a little bit of linguistic acrobatics. But yeah, I think in the right context it would be perceived that way, and I think especially if you were to think about like a doctor's office encounter, if a doctor was asking, what words do you prefer for your genitals, that might be more uncomfortable because of the pattern.
Please join me in thanking Dr. Zimman for an excellent